So I know that some of you are already aware of this, especially the biblical nerd types among us, but I don't think I've shared it here, so I want to loop in the rest of you on the excitement, in case you haven't been reading like the biblical scholarship journals in your spare time. Over the last few years, there's been some really fascinating biblical research emerging about the passage we just heard read and sung from this pulpit. And maybe some of you are now internally groaning, but I'm going to make it exciting. I always try to make it exciting, okay? But I should say it started with scholar Elizabeth Schrader Pulzer, who was then a PhD student at Duke University studying early Christianity. She's now an assistant professor at Villanova. But a few years ago, she was doing her dissertation investigating early manuscripts of the Gospel of John. And she noticed an unusual number of textual variants in this section that Desiree Eden just read for us, what we call John 11. And by textual variants, I mean differences between the different manuscripts we have of those early texts. We know thousands of manuscripts of the books in the Bible, little pieces, and some are tiny pieces of parchments, or some are all rolled up, and some they found in some monk's trash can 500 years ago. You know, there's a big body of manuscripts of the Bible. And biblical scholars, especially those who focus on the subspecialty of textual criticism, this is what they do all day. They look with their little scope at these various pieces of fragments, and they compare various versions of biblical manuscripts, and they try to figure out how the texts were growing and changing in the early life of Christianity and what that means. So they'll say, okay, here's a manuscript of the Gospel of Matthew from 250 CE, and it calls the man released in the place of Jesus during the Passion, Jesus Barabbas. But by the time we look at manuscripts of Matthew from the 400s, they just call him Barabbas. You know, why? What's with that? That's what they say. That's sort of what gets them up in the morning. Now, and because the manuscripts of the Bible were copied by hand for the first 1,500 years or so, you know, many of these textual variants are unintentional clerical errors. You know, scholars who just got tired at the end of the day and skipped words or omitted lines. I mean, how many of you just today have made some kind of typo in a text message you're sending? But a lot of them are clearly intentional changes, additions, or deletions. Times when scribes added words or phrases or entire sections. Now, sometimes this seems like it was for clarity, sometimes to better reflect the theology of the time in which these documents are being written. And it's not really difficult to imagine how this happens. If you were retyping an email your friend wrote to somebody really important like their boss, you might correct what you perceive to be misspellings on their behalf, right? You might add a few words for clarity if it seemed like there was some ambiguity. You might delete things you thought were wrong. Does that make some amount of sense? So that's how we get textual variants. And this, if this is new information, it might sound like a really big deal, but some of these are actually just in our regular Bible. You'll see sections of the Gospels with brackets or sections in italics, and a note at the bottom of the page that says, we're just not sure this was in the original. Like the whole last chapter of the Gospel of Mark's a great example. And I could go on and on. As I was writing this, I thought, I had a lot to say about textual variants. But this is not an hour-long lecture. It's like a 15-minute sermon. So we need to stay focused on John 11. So in John 11, Schrader Pulzer noticed there were a lot of textual variants. And going back to some of the earliest manuscripts we have of John, she noticed something pretty interesting, which was that in a handful of them, there was only one sister present at this scene. In other manuscripts, one could see where references to Mary had been crossed out and changed to Martha, and nouns and verbs that had been singular changed to plural. It's not true in all the manuscripts, but in some of the earlier manuscripts this is true. And so Schrader Pulzer noticed that it's possible that somewhere along the line, someone added a second sister, Martha. Now the reasons for this are myriad and have to do with synthesizing things that happen in the other Gospels, and the full explanation, again, is more apropos to the aforementioned hour-long lecture. And if you're interested in learn more, there's amazing videos on this. It's a great one by Diana Butler Bass. But for now, I want to invite you to just go forward with me, agreeing to imagine for a moment that in some version of this, there was only one sister. There was just only Mary, the sister of Lazarus. And that Mary is the same Mary who plays a significant role in the rest of the gospel, the one that we know as Mary Magdalene. Now, maybe you remember from Sunday school, Mary Magdalene is the first person who sees the risen Jesus at the end of the story, and the first person who tells the good news of that to someone else. So we're thinking about that, and then looking at this story, we see that here it is Mary, or could be Mary, not Martha, who makes the first Christological confession of the gospel. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world. Now, if we think about that for a minute, if we imagine that's true, you can see that it elevates Mary quite a bit in importance in this gospel, putting her on par with the role Peter plays in the other gospels, right? She's the first one to say who Christ is, and she's the first one to see Christ be resurrected, and she's the first one to share that good news with someone else. Now, because it's Women's History Month, I will just add a little rhetorical detail, which is that it's not difficult for me to imagine that might not have sat well with some folks in the early church. A woman sitting at the central place in the ministry of Jesus, at least according to John. And there may have been some Peter supporters back then, and there was a lot of struggle, we know this from Acts, about who has authority in the early church. You can imagine maybe there were some Peter supporters who thought we could solve this by diluting Mary's influence and sort of spreading out her significant acts and confessions and giving some of her lines in this whole drama to her imagined sister Martha. I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm saying it's easy for me to imagine that. A lot of that's lost to time now, but scholars are increasingly seeing this as a distinct possibility. Now, there's some even more exciting research, and we're really geeking out here, and this is beside the point, but I just feel excited about it and want to tell you, that indicates Magdalene, which we have always understood as referencing Mary's place of origin, many scholars now think might actually refer to something about her. The word Magdalene corresponds to the Greek word for tower. So in the same way that Simon Peter is Simon the rock, Mary Magdalene is Mary the tower. Cool, right? Super cool. And now that I've told you all that, it's almost the end of the sermon. So what does this have to do with Lent and prayer and fasting and Mr. Rogers and the world falling apart in our own spiritual experience? Okay. Well, this new research really centers Mary's experience, and it frames her as the only one who really gets it, really gets what's going on with Jesus, the only one who understands what this is all about, what Jesus is all about, what his ministry and presence are all about. But what I want to draw our attention to is that she makes this declaration in the midst of a time of intense grief. Right? She has lost her brother. He's dead and stinking in the tomb, and she stands before Jesus, and she makes this confession that no one has ever made about Jesus being the Son of God. And you think about it, she's going to come back in a number of chapters and make a similar confession while also standing in front of a tomb, right? Grief now compounded by the execution of her friend and teacher. I think that parallel is also really important, right? Twice she faces death and loss, and at that moment confesses that Jesus is the Messiah. And for me, this is just so important. This feels so relevant. To think that this is what the gospel all comes down to, right? Like, yes, it's a story about morals and comportment and how we connect to the sacred and turn the other cheek and how we do justice in the world. And it is also, on a very deep level, a word of hope to those of us who have lost something. To those of us who have something we love that is dead in a tomb somewhere. whether that is a person or a dream or a possibility for our future or our sense of safety and belonging or our faith in democracy or whatever, somewhere, something we need, someone we love, something we once had hope for is on the other side. If that is true for us, then this is a story for us. This is a story for those of us who have pressed ourselves against that stone for longer than we would like to admit. It's a story for those of us who have grieved, for those of us who have mourned, for those of us who have wept our share of tears. This story is a promise that speaks into that place of stinking loss and death a word of hope and possibility. And so to say we have faith in Christ, as Mary does, is to say that we can believe that someday, somehow, some way, somewhere, things we lost will be restored to us. But I think what's most meaningful about Mary's story is that we still lost them, right? The story doesn't deny that. I think that's so important. There are a lot of Christians out there, many right here around us in the community actually, that believe the most natural posture for confession that Jesus is the Messiah is a fist raised in triumph, right? This is a Jesus who uses strength to take power over other people. But I think this intimate moment with Mary shows us a different way, shows us that a natural place to confess that Jesus is the Messiah is in our deepest moments of loss. Rather than an arm raised in triumph, a posture that also befits such a confession is hands cupped together, gathering our own tears. In this, Jesus' strength is in the power of God to bring back what has been lost, is being lost. And I think maybe there isn't any more important word for the church to speak to a world that is grieving. Because, man, I keep looking around and seeing sadness and brokenness and war and death at every turn. And the person that I need to guide me through that world is Mary. Is the tower in the midst of the grief that living in this world brings. The one who whispers to us, Jesus Christ is the one who is coming. Jesus Christ is the one who is coming, which means that more is possible than we thought. That what is broken can be repaired, that the piece that has been shattered can be remade, and that that which has died has not really reached an end. And I wonder if maybe we've gotten this far, maybe that is our best and most simple prayer here as we reach the end of Lent. Maybe that becomes our only confession, that Jesus is the one who is coming. That Jesus is the one who is coming into the deepest parts of our life, into the saddest parts of this world to make it new again. That Jesus is the one who is coming to move the stone and to call out that which has died and bring it to life again. I am so glad for the opportunity to follow Mary on this journey and hope that you too might find a guide in her as she weeps and yet has faith in the hope that is to come and the life that is on the other side. So I offer you her story in the name of the God who created, redeemed, and sustained us always. Amen.